Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have Jordan Lips back on. Again, we're at probably at least 5+ episodes now at this point. So welcome back on, man. Looking forward to having you on. Feel like we probably try to do this, every 3 to 4 months, I feel like is kind of the frequency there of it. Like once a quarter, maybe, I guess you would call it.
Yeah, I mean, it's been great. I love coming on. We always have good chats, and it's always like I know we're following a lot of the same people, so it's good to just kind of get a temperature check of like what other people are thinking as we all consume a lot of the same info.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Just kind of state of the union almost in a way, right? Kind of see where we're at with everything. So I appreciate you coming back on, man. Like, everybody loves these episodes when you come on. So obviously when I get good feedback for guests, I got to get them back on. So yeah, man. So I guess since we've chatted, it's been a couple months. Sure, a few things have been going on your end. Any like updates there? I guess maybe just start with any life updates that you got, and then we'll dive into like some training, nutrition type stuff.
Not a whole lot. Things are the same. I'm getting married pretty soon, going on honeymoon pretty soon, but not really anything crazy outside of that, which has been the same for a while now, but all good things. All is well here.
I was going to ask you, when are you getting married?
17 days.
So it is coming up very quickly.
Oh, it's coming up. It's absolutely coming up. Yep.
Because I remember you got engaged, I think literally like a couple weeks before me. I saw you got, and like, man, he he beat me to the punch on that one. So you guys had about a year engagement. We're getting married in November, so it's been a pretty long engagement on our end. You guys ready at this point to get it done?
Yeah, we're ready. I don't even know if that's long. I feel like people are engaged for like a very wide range of time.
You're right. It could definitely be way longer than a year and a half, like we had. So it really does depend. Are you guys getting married in Austin? You guys going back home, or?
We're headed back home. It's just easier we're the only ones who have to come home. Everyone's already there. So that's just like an easier way. We have a couple of friends from here that are going to fly back, but that's an easier logistics to manage. Yeah.
Cool. Any like stress or anything from it, or has it been pretty smooth?
Oh yeah. Oh, totally. But I'm, you know what? I have no real, like, I've never been married, of course, and I don't have any marriage advice, but something I've learned has been very helpful is like, whenever we're like working on something together, whether it's the wedding or something, it's about like dividing the tasks into the tasks that you don't mind doing. And so like me doing the decor or something is a highly stressful / I won't do a good job at it. So it's just almost like chores in the house. Like a lot of like what we like our communication just as a couple has been about like, hey, what are the things we both need to do together? And how can we split this up into like the way where you're doing things that you care about, you will do well, and you'll actually like take care of them and you'll feel less stressed doing it. What are the things that you feel really stressed out doing? Can I take care of those sort of things? And so with the wedding, it's not so stressful because we've divided it in a way where it's like, I can't be bothered with certain things. Like, not I can't be bothered, but like I'd get super stressed out, like picking out like the colors of stuff or like, some of the other like designer drinks or whatever things we're doing. Like, but like if we're talking about like looking at the DJ's music or, the food stuff, which I'm obviously would love to be incredibly involved in. So it's been fun because we've realized that like there are certain things that I just like, she can't be bothered with, I can't be bothered with. And so we kind of divide and conquer there.
That's good, man. That's how it should be. You guys focus on the things that you're better at doing anyways and whatnot. So what about honeymoon? Where are you guys going for that?
We are going to Africa for 2 weeks, and
I
could not be more excited. And so that's going to be just epic. Looking forward to that. It's going to be awesome.
Did you find your gym down there?
I'm interested to see what we're just like total tongue in cheek. Like I'm not like going to try and work out because I'm afraid of losing gains, but shit, man, if there's like, I love working out on vacation and just like, it's like a playground. I love just like walking into a hotel gym. I have no clue. I highly doubt. Actually, I'm sure I could look, but we're staying at like air quote 5-star places, not air quote, real 5-star places, but they're in like the bush. Like we're talking, there's no like, this isn't like a high rise, these are like 5-star in the middle of the bush, like places. So I have no idea if there's like exercise stuff that'd be cool to play around with, but I haven't even thought about it.
Yeah, right. I agree with you. It's like on vacation, really try to use that time to just, enjoy training or like you said, just kind of mess around a little bit. Like you said, just to make it fun. Cause you don't want to take it too seriously when you're, especially on your honeymoon too, right? Like you obviously want to enjoy that period of time. So cool. So it just sounds like you're just going to kind of see what they got. And if they got something, you're going to do that. I imagine, and I don't think this is where it's at, but have you ever seen that like outdoor gym where it's like, it's got like those big old weights and like people do like pull downs, they like sit in a bat and like
in Tulum in Mexico.
Is that where that's at?
Yeah.
Okay, because
That's funny because I was thinking about that same thing. Now that I'm looking, I just while you were talking, I went on Google and I Googled one of the places we're staying in, and it was the place that I suspect is the most likely to have a gym. Someplace in Nairobi. It's like the place that's the least in the bush. It's like more of a hotel, and it definitely has a gym. But I'm like browsing the pictures and like it's good. I mean, we might get a workout in, but maybe not. I look forward to the idea of taking 2 full weeks off.
yeah,
It's something I haven't done in ever maybe potentially. And so that is I'll go in with the mindset of like I'm taking 2 weeks off, and if we feel like moseying into the gym just for fun, I think we'll feel fine doing that.
yeah, and I think that's a good spot to be in, man. Where it's like you're in a spot where it's like you're not freaking out about not being able to like train hard for 2 weeks, because I think
Sure.
mentally, man, that can weigh on you. And I know in the past I've been there before, where it's like, oh, if I got to have one day off, it's like I'm going to lose all my muscle, and obviously that's not the case. But sometimes it is cool, like you said, to just kind of have either take some time off, but also just kind of mess around and do whatever you can in there, and maybe find some machines. I'm assuming they probably won't have any prime a prime machine there or anything like that in the hotel gym.
No, probably not. But yeah, no, I definitely take a playground mentality. I love just like walking in the gym, seeing what they have. Jen and I have done that a few times. We were recently in Vegas, just like we'll probably talk about today, and we were just like, hey, let's pop down to the gym, like see what they have, like, and just enjoy ourselves, just mess around, get a pump, and no stress.
What about like nutrition side of things? Same thing. You'll just kind of just whatever is kind of there. And I'm wondering too, like what the cuisine will be like when you're down there as well too.
Yeah, so am I. I'm pumped to fully immerse myself in the cuisine and not, I'll get a vegetable and a fruit when I can, and I'll get protein as a priority. But those also very much fall in line with how I prefer to eat anyway. But I'm gonna go like native cuisine as priority number one, and like nutrition in air quotes as a number two. I would feel like shit if I reprioritize, if I flipped those two and came back and like didn't have a real good idea of what the cuisine was like. And so I'm pumped to see what that's like. I've had a lot of people that are like, hey, you got to try this, and I've heard a lot of good things, and so really excited to see how that goes. But I mean, not to like act like I'm up on some like I've reached some nutrition or fitness nirvana. I'm really not worried about it, not even one iota, if from a nutrition or a training perspective. I just know that it just doesn't make a difference, and that's a nice place to be mentally. I like you said, I probably haven't been there forever. This is probably the last like 3 to 5 years where I felt a little bit more relaxed about everything, and it's just really, I mean, it's a fantastic place to be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm glad you said that too. It's not like you're at some fitness and nutrition nirvana, right? It's like, but you definitely, your mindset has improved, and I think that's important. So, leading up to it, what's your training been like recently? Anything that you're specifically working on that? I think last time, I can't remember I know at one point you were working on like keeping the same exercises in for a while. So, and I think you are kind of trying that minimalist approach, I think, now that I think about it. So I'm just curious to kind of hear how your training's going and whatnot.
Yep. At that time, I was running just like a little N of 1 experiment of keeping the program exactly the same for as long as possible until something made me change it, whether that was just like psychological boredom or I stopped progressing or I started getting joint pain. And that was a fun experiment. And we talked about last time, we don't need to dive back in, but I'm absolutely in a very minimalist, very maintenance mode. And so trying to see how little training I can do and maintain and see if it's maintained, see if it's grow. But I'm definitely flirting with that bottom end volume with a clear understanding that if I undershoot my like minimum effective volume a little bit, that I'm going to be at maintenance volume. And I'm at like 70 minutes a week of upper body. Not that minutes is the perfect proxy, but just keeps it in perspective. We can talk set numbers and stuff too, but 70 minutes a week upper body. Lower body is a little bit longer just because I'm also doing some PT for my ankle. And then starting to incorporate some of this zone 2 stuff, which is definitely where like, not like I'm freaking turning into cardio bunny now, but I'm certainly like looking to grow my understanding of that in the pursuit of like optimizing health. And so definitely like, when in doubt, making sure I'm prioritizing that. And so right now I'm running a upper, lower, zone 2, then upper, lower, zone 2, then off. And I play soccer once a week, which is like my like zone 5, let's say, which is like my higher intensity cardio, which is a lot of training which is a lot of days of training, but none of those real workouts. The zone 2 is the longest, and it's 60 minutes. The other days are in that like 35 to 55 minutes or so. And so it's like, oh, you're I only train with weights 4 days. I do something 6 days. None of them are incredibly crazy intense. And so, yeah, I feel like I'm recovering well. It feels like a nice split.
Well, I was going to ask you that with you taking this kind of minimalist approach and like less volume for training, weight training specifically, have you noticed like that recovery really improve or not, or is it the same? And yeah, maybe just kind of fill me, just touch on that a little bit.
Yeah. Recovery is definitely top notch. I mean, I'm definitely never feeling, I mean, that's what you'd expect with maintenance volume. Like the idea would be like, it's such a low stress that it won't even cause an adaptation. So it's certainly not causing a ton of fatigue. And so I'm definitely like not fatigued, not tired. I don't really take a deload. We can talk about that. I do take a deload, but I'll take like a short deload, like a 3 consecutive days off, and then I'll start again. I probably train a little bit closer to failure on average, just to hedge that bet a little bit. And we've had many chats in the past about like SFR and stuff. And if I organizing it well, I've found that like if I have exercise that are provide a high degree of stability, that me going 2 RIR or 0 or even beyond length and partials, myos, feels pretty sustainable for me. It doesn't feel like I'm pushing the boundaries of what I can recover from at all, frankly. And is actually what is leading me to believe that I'm probably just a hair above maintenance volume. But to be honest with you, I don't really know. I'll be doing some measurements like once a year probably to see, just because I'm at maintenance calories. So like, it's just not a whole lot going to change. Even if the difference between how much I'll grow at like a minimum effective volume or like maximum adaptive volume or maximum recoverable volume, it's all so small at this point in my career, like training career, that I'm just keeping expectations incredibly low. And if it turns out to be maintenance volume, that's great. At this moment in time, I'm super happy with that.
How does you having this lower volume approach and maintenance and you being closer to, like you said, your maintenance, maybe MEV, how does that affect your exercise selection? Do you find that you change that up to match that, like or is it still relatively the same for you?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't really change it does change my exercise selection insofar as like I really will prioritize compound lifts in the sense that like I'll do a little bit, like if I was training at MAV or MRV with like more volume, like I'd probably have more knee flexion, knee extension. I'd probably have more elbow flexion, elbow extension. I'd probably have more like direct front and medial and rear delt work and breaking up each of the heads of the delts into, each of them get an exercise sort of thing. Whereas right now I'm probably more prioritizing bilateral pulling and pressing, just covering more bases with those, but hitting each thing at least one time directly, just to kind of say, hey, if I'm going to get some like secondary ancillary volume from my pressing, maybe I can pair that together with one extra exercise for this head of the delt. And with those two stimuli, that's at least enough to maintain. And that's been going pretty well. I think, not that it hasn't affected my exercise selection, because I think it absolutely has, but it definitely has affected my going like proximity to failure and intensity techniques and stuff like that. And I'm just really trying to recalibrate how I feel about this idea of going closer to failure is more fatiguing, because I think that in a just like as a sentence is true. Going closer to failure is more fatiguing. Is it exponentially more fatiguing? Maybe, but I think the magnitude in which it is more fatiguing comes down to the exercise selection. Like the difference between a 2 and a 0 RIR in my incline curls for me is nothing. No, it's no discernible amount of fatigue. It's not like, oh, I can really tell I went to 0 RIR because I'm systemically fatigued. But maybe like if I were to take that same approach with all of my RDLs and back squats, that maybe I would feel the effects of really pushing that much closer to failure, but I haven't. And so I feel pretty comfortable where if I'm going to do lower volume, I'm going to try and find a pretty high stability exercise that I can push to failure and eventually beyond into partials, into myos, into drop sets. Because that degree of stability really, for me, makes that additional fatigue from getting closer to failure something I can't even feel personally. And even if I absolutely wreck myself with the sets I'm doing, I'm just not doing so many sets that I'm hitting that, like my fatigue is overflowing. I'm unable to recover. And so I am thinking, okay, for me, it's instead of choosing like a set number that I'm sticking to, it's what do I realistically have time for, and what's my mental bandwidth for these days. And then I'm going to put a bunch of high stability exercises in there, and I'm going to train them as hard as humanly possible, and I'm going to see what happens. And if that means that I feel like I'm recovering great and progressing, then I know I'm doing an amount that I can recover from. And if it happens that I'm like, wow, 3-4 weeks into the meso, like I'm regressing, I'm feeling like I'm fatigued, I'm chronically sore, then I know I'm doing too much. But I'm certainly beginning with what can I realistically commit to right now? And I know that number, whether it's minutes or sets or days a week, some matrix of those three, that I could probably train balls to the wall in that time frame and probably not see myself overtrain in any way. And so that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm like, hey, I can't, I'm just in a place right now where I am choosing not to train that much. And so I know that because I've decreased the amount of quote volume I'm doing, that I could probably can and probably should train incredibly hard when I have the opportunity to, especially on higher stability stuff. And maybe I'll look back and have a different opinion 5 years from now, because I probably had a different opinion 5 years ago, but it really does match with what I want to be doing right now, which is get in, train really hard. If I happen to make some gains, that's great. But like, if I happen to maintain and it's only costing me 140 minutes a week, I'm down with that.
Right. Yeah. Well, I feel like too, the failure aspect of it's interesting because, like you said, you're doing less volume, so that kind of frees up some space for you to really push that failure, closer to failure if you need to. And I feel like that's where some people end up kind of getting themselves stuck, as they do, stay far away from it. So it's like you end up kind of having to do like more volume if you want to kind of see that stimulus that you're going for. So it sounds like with that, with dropping the volume, you've been able to really kind of increase that intensity across, like, sounds like all sets and almost all exercises. And I had this conversation a while back with somebody, and like, people definitely have that like lower volume, high intensity approach. And some people have that higher volume, lower intensity approach. And really, I think it just kind of comes down to like, what can you like do, like, and stick with, right? Like, what do you enjoy? Because some people don't like that uncomfortableness of like getting to failure for like 1 to 2 sets, whereas some people love that. And like, that's what they do. Right. And so I think, again, it just goes to show that there's a lot of like flexibility here with hypertrophy training.
Couldn't agree more. I think that that's absolutely the case. Yeah, totally.
So when you say something like, you're talking like more stable, things like that, are we talking like, what would be an example of that? Like back squat versus leg extension, or would you consider a back squat to fall in that? Or what does that look like?
Yeah, I'm training at home, so I'm definitely limited in terms of lower body high stability movements. I'm RDLing, I'm split squatting, I'm back squatting. So not a ton of high stability. I'll try and find whatever stability I can, whether I'm doing Bulgarians with holding onto the rack with one arm so that I can just focus on just like pressing. But yeah, certainly more so with the upper body exercises. It's just training at home. It's funny. I went to lift with a friend at a local gym. We just wanted to mess around. We wanted to get a session in. Instead of going to the garage, I was like, let's get a little change of scenery. Let's go to this gym. And it's like the mecca, in big eye roll air quotes, of bodybuilding in Texas, I think, which maybe some people, that's not true, but that's what they call themselves. It's called House of Gains, which is like totally par for the course. And they have the most ridiculous equipment, the best equipment. They don't have any prime equipment, but if you can imagine every other good piece of equipment you can imagine other than prime stuff, they have it. They have every arsenal piece of equipment. They have 2 different hip presses, 2 different pendulums, 4 different hack squats. And so going there and just, they have a bunch of different, like 8, I shit you not, like 6 different kinds of leg presses, different brands, the Cybex squat press, the unilateral one, the Arsenal one, like different angles. They got the horizontal hack squat. They got all this stuff, and it's great. It's like old school, but at the same time, they're like mixing in new machines. Anyway, long story short, for lower body, I was like, I might need to, if I really wanted to, like, if I was looking at all to either for some variation or to push my legs a little bit more, I'm like, yeah, either I'm going to need a hack squat or a leg press, or something like that. But for upper body, certainly like, chest supports whenever available, for sure. Even if it's just like holding on with one arm while I do unilateral work, or like some cable pressing, added stability in my costal press by like hanging the fucking weights from my dip chain so I can stay on the ground, finding ways to increase stability so I can push a little bit harder without other things failing. I mean, that's a normal thing you should be doing for hypertrophy, is like, finding exercises that provide more stability so you can in general have other things fail less often. But when you're trying to train more like a minimalist, that's even more important, because I have to go closer to failure, which makes me more at risk for other shit failing first. And so if I can get that stability, it's just a knob you'll want to turn up a little bit more when you're trying to do less sets and get closer to failure with them without having your lower back fail, your core fail, or cardiovascular system fail, or stuff like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So real quick, before we dive into the topic, you mentioned zone 2. I've had Brian on to talk about it. Episode hasn't released yet, but by the time this does, it will be out. But we talked about, like modalities and things. What do you use for your zone two?
Yeah, I just bought a treadmill for the house. And I think when we're talking about zone two is you can do zone two in an infinite amount of ways because zone two is not a modality. It is something happening physiologically. It is a state of intensity. And so you can do that anywhere. However, there's a little bit of a benefit to a Stairmaster or a treadmill in such that you can set it and forget it. And so you can set your speed on a treadmill, you can set your speed on a Stairmaster. And once you know that, okay, I'll give my example. Once I put 10 incline and 3.2 on the treadmill, I know that that's going to get me in zone two. And I can just turn the monitor off and I can watch something and I don't need to think about it at all. And if you use something like a bike, like just the same thing, you just get yourself into zone two. The problem is you're manually keeping the pace. And so, listen, that's not outside of the realm of what humans can handle. Humans can look, you can look at the thing and be like, oh, I've slowed down the last 5 minutes. Let me pick back up. But it is just one thing you'll have to do is monitor your pace, which is fine. Totally fine. But I find that the incline walking for me is just so good for getting in zone two, keeping me in zone two, letting me multitask. Because I promise zone two is so boring. It's not so boring. It's pretty boring, but it should be boring. That you should really, if you're going to do it for the long haul, find something to do while you're doing zone two. And I just feel like I'd be worse at doing that if I had a bike. Now I do want to get a bike, just experience that for sure. But as of right now, I really I did it on the Stairmaster the other day, which I thought was awesome. Same idea. I found a speed and kind of whatever the speed and resistance on there that moved. And all I had to do was not fall off and I would stay in zone two. And so those are my 2 cents in terms of modalities, but I also love the elliptical from an impact perspective. I know that's like, it's just like some people have like a weird connotation with the elliptical. Elliptical's awesome. And so, yeah, I'm all modalities will work, but there's a benefit to being able to set it and forget it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah. Cause then like you said, the bike or I guess even the elliptical too, you do have to kind of make sure you monitor that where, like you said, you can go and kind of zone off in a way. You can zone out for zone two cardio if you want, if you preset it. Yeah, super interesting stuff. I was when I was talking to Brian about it, we kind of realized that like I do absolutely none because I walk, weight train, or play hockey, and like none of those are going to get me in that range. Do you feel like you get out of breath when you do the zone two with the incline walking, or what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I think I don't because that would in some ways violate what zone two is. And so I don't. I think that as far as proxies go for zone two, like one of them that I find is there are some that are more specific and more general. One of them that's quite general, but I've been connecting with more is the idea that while I'm on there, I should feel like I could do this forever. Yeah. You can't obviously, but I should feel like your zone two should be over because you're bored and the timer's up, not because you're so tired you really need to get off. Yeah. And the other one that's helped me is how in the zone I feel. And so when I'm doing like I've been rehabbing my ankle, and so my coach has had me do some runs just to build up that impact. And I feel very in the zone. You get a little bit of that runner's high, like in air quotes, and you're like in the zone. You're feeling every step you make, right? You're like, you got the music going and you're in it. That should not happen in zone two. In zone two, you should be more ADHD, looking around at everything, people watching, and you shouldn't be in the zone. And so I've been paying close attention to those two. And it turns out I've probably been going a little bit too hard. And those are really helpful for me to realize that I was just a hair, just maybe a hair going too fast and whatever. That's been helpful.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like there's some trial and error to it for sure in terms of figuring out what's going to work best for you in terms of what to use. And then obviously actually from there, actually finding it. So, yeah, super interesting stuff, man. And that's definitely picking up a lot of steam right now. And so it's interesting to see, where that goes and everything like that. So cool. Let's dive into the topic for today. As always, hypertrophy talk. So you recently gave a talk at the Coaches Summit. I think that's what they called it. And it was in Vegas. And so I wanted to hop on here or have you come on here and talk about it. And, you obviously put a lot of time into making that presentation and everything. So, I'm curious to kind of hear some of your takeaways and maybe just some things that, you learned throughout and maybe some things that you think are important for the audience to know with that.
For sure. Yeah. And so the topic or the talk was titled, How Much Volume Do You Need for Hypertrophy? And what we can learn from a minimalist approach. And it was just taking a look at a couple of studies that kind of looked at the study's main goal was looking at how many sets would be optimal for hypertrophy, but doing a deeper dive into the studies, one from 2017, one from 2019, there were, I think, undervalued pieces of information within there for as far as like people making really, really great gains with very, very little. And so if I were to try and give a little bit of things that I think are important to understand, number one, the biggest and most important thing that I would say is that volume recommendations are ridiculous. And they're ridiculous because they're more ridiculous than calorie recommendations. Calorie recommendations, you get like a calorie calculator. I mean, I think we're all on the same page here that you should take that with a massive grain of salt. If you plug in your TDE calculator, your precision nutrition calculator, like you get your calories, you need to be like, hey, this is ballpark for me. With volume recommendations, it's that like squared. Because, you know, if you ask somebody how much volume you should do for hypertrophy, you typically will get someone who says something around 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week. But that is so ridiculously not helpful. I'm not saying that it's not helpful, that we shouldn't even, it's like such a hard thing to quantify that we shouldn't even bother trying to give recommendations. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is like, that is like saying you should eat 2,000 calories up to 4,000 calories. Like we're talking about 10 or double 10. And so what that should tell you is that this range, like the range being wide AF in terms of recommendation. And I'll backtrack a little bit, because if you ask somebody, how many sets should I do for hypertrophy? If that's the way you phrase it, and somebody says 10 to 20, that's incorrect. Because that's probably where we see your best hypertrophy. And one of the points that I think we've just slowly shrunk down our rhetoric from 10 to 20 sets to make your best gains to you got to do 10 to 20 sets for hypertrophy. That's not true. You can almost certainly make gains with less. Certainly depends on training age, nutritional status, and it depends on so many things. And that's kind of what I'll rant on for now, is that range is so wide for two main reasons. Number one is there's vast individual differences. We see people who grow better with less. We see people who grow better with more and who could benefit and recover from more. And so there's a wide range of individual differences, and not so wide that general starting places shouldn't even be used, but wide enough that, or big enough differences between individuals that it's worth taking it with a big grain of salt and making sure that you're cognizant of, is this working for me, which we could talk about in a second. And the second thing that you should notice when there's a wide AF range like this is that it's not an exact science, because what you do and how you do it matters a metric fuck ton. And so if you're doing it's like you could survive, you know, I'm not picking on Brett Contreras here. Brett's like mad smart and has contributed a ton to the community, but Brett's program, like one of the things that it touts is they do 36 sets of glutes per week. But if you look at what they're doing, it's like at least 1/3 to 2/3 short position movements and bands. And so like that to me like is different. Like, you know, that it's just like what and how you're doing things, whether you're training length of position, where you're getting closer to failure, where you're executing things well, what sort of tempo are you using? You know, they all matter a ton. And so it doesn't tell us a whole lot. If somebody says, hey, you got to do 10 sets of quads per week, because that's kind of the take home. You're like, okay, someone's like, got to do 10 to 20 sets. Let me start with 10 sets. Like, does 10 sets of hack squat count the same as 10 sets of leg extension? Of course not. Does 10 sets of hack squat at 1 RIR count the same as 10 sets of hack squat at 4 RIR? Of course not. What does muscle group even mean? 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week. Like, we got all this talk about iliac, lat, and costal pec, and clavicular pec, short head bicep, long head bicep. Like, do we need to be specific to discuss how many sets per week your costal pec needs to grow? Like, how specific are we going to get from a muscle division, you know, even muscle group? When we look at these studies, a lot of them use terminology like back. Like, I'm not shitting on that, by the way, because if you're going to be any more specific than that, then we just don't even have anything to study anymore, because we don't have studies that are that specific. But it's like the back, like, you know, if you just fucking go onto your Instagram right now, there's people who are absolutely losing their shit about how to bias every single fiber on the back, and they can do it in different ways. And so we're generalizing with, hey, 10 sets of back. It's like, what does that even mean? And so it's very much a starting point. It's very much about understanding how these variables interact, like we just talked about. If you're going to do 25, if you're going to do 36 sets of glutes, it can't be all length and position. Excuse me. It can't be all length and position. Can't be all compound lifts. Can't be all close to failure. There's no way you wouldn't survive it. If you're going to do 6 sets for glutes and you're going to expect a growth, then it probably can't be any band work. It probably can't be much, if any, real short position exercises. And there's an interplay between, the anatomical training position, the resistance profile, how close you get to failure, your lifestyle, how many sets you can actually recover from in terms of like all those factors compared to your sleep and calorie intake and hydration. There's also genetics. And so, in my presentation, I go through a lot of these examples as to why this is actually a tough thing to even give a recommendation for. But I don't think it's so complicated that we can't give recommendations. I think it's mostly just important for the end user to understand that this isn't gospel. That range is so wide that you should be kind of rolling your eyes at like, okay, once I'm somewhere near that range, I really got to start to figure out what's right for me. And the cool part is for hypertrophy, it's not actually that complicated to find out if something's working for you. It sounds like an oversimplification, but if reps and load, both obviously over the longer term, if they're going up over the long term, you're making muscle growth. You're growing muscle, you're making muscle gains, whatever. And if you tack on weight gain, if you're gaining weight and your reps and load are going up over the long term, so 3 variables, weight gain, reps, load going up, and over the long term, if those 3 things, you're checking those 3 boxes, even without the weight gain, because we know you can build some muscle at maintenance for sure. You're pretty good. I think like if someone's like, hey, is this enough volume for me? Like, am I doing enough volume? First thing I'm going to ask them is like, have you progressed over the last 6 months? Have you been able to add some reps and load in the hypertrophy rep range? We're not talking about doing singles and doubles. And if you have, then man, it's hard. It'd be impossible for me to mount an argument that you're not growing. And so if you tacked on weight gain there, I'd rest easy. I'd put my career on it. But if someone's like, yeah, I've been PRing every meso for the last 6 mesos in all my lifts, and am I building muscle? I'd be like, God, I have a really hard time arguing that you're not. And so if someone's like, hey, am I doing too much volume? And then my follow-up would be like, well, are you recovering in a way in which you can PR meso to meso? And it's the same question. Are you progressing? If you're doing too little volume, you won't progress because you're not getting enough stimulus. If you're doing too much volume, you won't progress because you're not recovering from session to session, week to week, and you'll eventually start to, overreach, get too stressed out, under recover, and eventually regress in your training, or you get sick or you get injured or those things. And so this like what we're left with is this like North Star of like, am I progressing? And for most people, I think going back to our discussion, which I think parallels really nicely, is like, once you're doing enough volume, I think it is about, I think the ceiling for most people in terms of volume is not this question of what's optimal. For most people, it's like making the most of the time they already have. And so instead of like, what's the most optimal amount of hypertrophy, or what's the most amount of what is the optimal amount of volume for hypertrophy? It's like, what is the best way for me to make the most of the time limitations that I have, that most of us have who aren't pro bodybuilders? How do I make the most of that time? That is a way more productive question, because I guarantee you it's an amount of volume that is less than what is optimal for hypertrophy. And so I'm not saying that that's a question that is null. There's no point in doing that. But someone's like, hey, what's optimal for hypertrophy? And I'm like, dude, if you can only work out 4 days a week, then you won't get to the amount of volume that probably you'd grow the absolute best. So let's work with the days that you have. Let's make the most of them, and let's match them to your personal preference in the way you like to train, like we were just talking about, where it's like maybe you like 1 or 2 a top set back off, or maybe you like 2 top sets or 1 top set, or you like training more RP style, 3 to 5 sets with like, starting at 3 RIR on all of them and progressing over time, a little bit higher volume. And so I'm much more in the camp of like, it's fun to talk about what's optimal, but most people will run into a time limitation before they reach what would technically be optimal. And so I'm much more interested in how do we make the most of the time you have, which pivots the discussion to how do I train more efficiently, which I think ends up being what the whole talk is all about.
Yeah, no, and we can chat about that in a little bit. So I just wanted to kind of go over a few things that you went over. So really, you were trying to find like, well, you were trying to dive a little bit deeper in terms of like, okay, when people ask like what the optimal set volume is like, okay, well, I'm going to look into this a little bit more to see like, how are they coming up with these numbers? And what you found was that like, hey, basically in these studies, it's like, first of all, there's large individual differences from the person. So that's a big thing. But how you go about that volume is going to really be the biggest indicator of like where you fall in that spectrum. And so really what we're left with is like, well, shit, we don't really have like a number here. Like it could be anywhere, right? But like you said, it's probably, if you work on that efficiency of training, and we'll talk about what that is, it's probably going to be a little bit lower. It's going to be lower than what you think you're going to need. Because like you said, I mean, essentially you're going to run into that time constraint before you're going to run into like, hey, what's the most optimal thing that you can do anyways?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's it in a nutshell. I think that we, if we wanted to be specific about some of the research, obviously there's the Schoenfeld 2017 meta-analysis where we saw groups kind of lumped into 1 to 4 sets per muscle group per week, or 5 to 9 sets per muscle group per week, or 10 or more sets per muscle group per week. And there were 15 studies in that meta-analysis, and I'm pulling this all out of my brain here. And they were 13 of the 15 studies were on untrained individuals. So that's certainly a limitation. But we saw that the people who trained with 10 or more sets per muscle group per week, up to 20, saw the best gains. And that was the take home from that paper. That was it. It was like, all right, bam. Like, because, not only are the people doing it, but the people reading it were only looking for what's optimal, because that's usually who decides to do research. That's usually the people who are most interested in research, because they're the most interested in making the best gains. And it's like usually like a trickle down from like maximalist mentality to, oh yeah, they're like, what's efficiency comes a little bit secondary. If you look at the group who trained with 1 to 4 sets per muscle group per week, they made 64% of the best gains. And so it's not like they didn't grow at all. They grew really well. They grew 64% as well as people who did 10 or more sets. People training 5 to 9, they grew 84% as well. The caveat is that they were beginners, totally valid. And for me, I think the 1 to 4 set per muscle group per week is really interesting for beginners, because I think it lines up incredibly well with our CDC guidelines for resistance training. It comes out to like roughly 2 days a week, 20 to 30 minutes, which is our CDC guideline for resistance training. And I think if you're dealing with beginners, you can totally fall back on this paper and be like, wow, we can do really well with 2 days a week, compound lifts, training hard. And as a beginner, you can see nice gains. I would probably say that that's not enough for a non-beginner. And so I'm all for that limitation of the paper for sure. But this idea that we throw out everything under 10 sets as, you can't grow, I think that that's objectively not true. And also in my experience, not true, for whatever that's worth, obviously, which is not much, to be fair. And it also depends on how you calculate volume. We didn't even go into that. Like these, 10 to 20 sets, I know this part to me fucking kills me, man. I'm sorry. But like 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week, if I have 5 people write a program based on that guideline, all 5 of them look different. Because that, and by the way, all of the papers that have looked at this, or the 2 at least that I think are the most prominent, they counted indirect volume, or like, let's say secondary muscle groups or synergist muscle groups equally from a volume perspective. So basically, if you did a pull-up, it counted for a full set of biceps. And so when you actually map out what 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week looks like, factoring that in, it's actually less than you think. And so there's just like a whole host of issues there, or at least like wrenches in this equation that aren't necessarily readily understood at first glance. I get people in my group all the time that are like, hey, your program is like pretty low volume. Like what gives, or I was doing more volume. And I'm like, that's cool. Like, how much volume do you think you need? And they're like, well, I've heard, such and such person said 10 to 20 sets. And I'm like, great. Based on that, I had a Zoom a couple of months ago back, and I was like, we're going to calculate our volume in the program. And that's funny is I hadn't done that. Just because at this point, intuitively, I can spot getting in the ballpark of like, I can look at a program without like fucking making the calculation. I can be like, this is low volume, it's moderate, it's high. So I hadn't actually, for this mesocycle, actually counted it out. So I had everyone on live Zoom, come to the Zoom, and we calculated it out. And it was like an average of like 16 sets per muscle group based on the way that study calculated it, that's being referenced. And so I always thought that that's funny. I'm like, that's cool. Like, you said you need 10 sets because of this study, you're doing 16, you're good to go. And so I do think that there's just like, it's just lost in translation, and that's totally fine. Most people don't need to be reading direct research, but I think once you're in the ballpark of enough volume, I think it's about what you can sustain, what you enjoy, and what is causing you to make progressions. And if it's causing you to make progressions and you feel good, the last slide is something Brian and I have talked about quite a bit, more of like a nihilistic thing of like, the last slide was like, even if you don't believe me, even if you think, training with the most volume that you can recover from is what you got to do if you want to get really jacked. Even if you think that, you're like, hey, minimalist style approach, you won't get there. Like, in my opinion, the difference between always training with just enough to make progress or training with the most amount that you can recover from, at some point, the graphs of what you look like, at some point they intersect. Because no matter what you do, there's genetic limitations, and you run into a point where growth slows down exponentially. And as long as you're always training with enough to grow, which is a minimalist mindset, because I'm putting the asterisk to the caveat of like, you've confirmed that this is enough for you. Whether it takes 5 years or in the first 5 years, training like a maximalist, maximum adaptive volume, pushing the boundaries of MRV, you probably grow more. But 10, 15 years, maybe you're a little bit bigger training. Maybe you're a little bit bigger. That's me throwing it a bone here. But hypothetically, you'd be kind of at this point of like a high percentage of your genetic limit where progress slows down so much anyway. It's like, if you train hard with enough volume to grow at all for 10, 15 years, you're going to end up looking basically identical. The only way you'd be able to tell is like measurements or a DEXA or something. You look the same to the outside world and to yourself. And so I just think that maybe that's, and if you follow, obviously you follow Jeff Alberts. Oh my God. 3DMJ Godfather. Why am I?
You got it.
Jeff Alberts. He's talked about this a lot, where it's like, he's like, I probably could have survived more volume across my training career, but maybe I wouldn't have survived it for 35 years injury free. Obviously he's a freak, genetic freak, but like, I see the merit in that too, where it's like, as long as I'm training with enough to grow, that might be the most joint friendly way to train. And maybe the most sustainable. And I'll end this monologue with, I've been a maximalist before, and I've been very interested in pushing the boundaries of my volume. And I've been in a point in my life where I didn't have time constraints, and this was very important. But I was like 24 with no kids and barely working, and this was my whole life. And so it was certainly a unique circumstance. And I don't regret those times, and I don't look down on those times. And if you're in that position right now where you're like, this is mega important, I'll make the time, I want to grow maximally, that's freaking awesome. And I love that. And I think there's sometimes going all in on something makes it more fun. And I would throw my hands up and totally understand that, where it's like, hey, I'll have the most fun with this if I'm going all in. And the idea of, doing something more of a minimalist that might make me have less fun, I totally get that. I think in the long run, you'll titrate between those two, kind of bounce back and forth maybe, or start as more of a maximalist, trend towards more of a minimalist. And so I find that all to be very fascinating. And at the end of the day, I don't work with any clients who have full reign to really explore the maximum amount of time that they could expend to hit this MRV, maximum adaptive, maximum recoverable volume. I way more have a clientele that want to make gains. Let's be real. We're not talking about like 2 days a week. Some people, yeah, but mostly people who want to make appreciable progress. And they're living in a place where like they really have to choose the right exercises, train really hard, potentially use intensity techniques, and they're probably still going to recover okay because they're not pushing these super high upper limits of like time and volume per session and time and volume per week. And so we really are more so trying to make the most out of limited time than we are like pursuing the optimal amount of volume. Wow, that was
no, I mean, a ton of great points in there. I got a couple things I want to hit on, but I like that you brought up the fact that like, even if you like really try to push it and you compare it with somebody that maybe goes a little bit slower, it's like they probably end up at around the same spot anyways. I think that just goes to show that like with muscle growth, like you can't like rush the process, right? Like at the end of the day, you can't, like you said, you can do things to make it, maybe I feel like once you get the basics with it and like you're progressing, things like that, it's like you can't like really speed it up unless obviously you take, roids or testosterone or something like that, right? Obviously that will be something that could speed it up a little bit. But again, that's another topic. But like at the end of the day, like you can't rush it. And like kind of I feel like what you're saying there was, if you are somebody that you really push it for a period of time, it's like at some point, you might have to deload a little bit more during that period of time. You might have to take more like longer recovery phases. You might get injured, and it's like eventually like you might end up at the same spot anyways, right? Even if you do really push it, because again, we are limited by our genetics when it comes to building muscle. I mean, that sucks to hear, but I mean, that is true, right? It is what it is. We can't do anything about that. So really good points there. And definitely a way to think about like, you know, taking this approach with it and why it can be beneficial. The other thing you hit on too, that I thought was important, that I was with these studies too, like you said, how they count volume is super important too, right? Because like you said, some people will count it to where it's like isolation is one, but then if you do like a pull down, they'll also count that towards bicep stuff. So it's like when they're doing like 25 sets of biceps, how much is that actually just bicep work, you know? And I feel like if you're not paying attention to that stuff, that can get lost. And that obviously is going to play a big role in like how much volume you think is right, as well too. So all good points there. I love that monologue. That's, we got to post that somewhere. But also one thing too, that you kind of mentioned throughout, and I feel like is important, is I feel like people definitely focus too much on like weight gain and like maybe like how much weight they're gaining for building muscle. And it's like they overlook the performance aspect, like where they feel best there with that, right? Like they get really bogged down on like, oh, I got to have this like surplus or this rate of gain. And if I'm not doing that, I'm not making progress. But it's like your performance is like such an important thing to look at that I feel like a lot of people overlook that part of it.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think the weight gain is just adds a layer of certainty that tissue is being added, and that it's not just neurological gains, that you're not just getting stronger because you're getting better at doing the movements. I think the weight gain is just a nail in the coffin of like, this is definitely in part, at least, if not the majority, due to accretion of new muscle tissue versus just neurological gains. And that's why I really put that caveat of like progressing over the long term. Because if you are listening to this and you're doing 12 sets per muscle group per week, whatever, and you cut it down to 7, I bet in the very short term, you are stronger. It's just a pseudo tapering phase where you decrease volume, express more strength, and you're like, oh my God, this is the perfect amount of volume. So I would recommend, and that was part of my experiment of doing the same stuff for the same, every meso doing the exact same program, was like trying to weed out those neurological gains, kind of let them wash away and see if I could still progress. And if, the two issues are, if you change things too often, then you can kind of get lost in, am I making neurological gains? Am I just getting better at a new movement because I haven't done it in a while? And so I do think that, that another kind of check in the box of the benefits of continuity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess so, to kind of wrap up this one, because we're coming here to the end. Well, I guess maybe I don't know if you wrapped up that presentation, because again, like I got the videos, I'm going to watch it, but I haven't found it yet. So I was hoping I could watch this before we had this conversation so I could get a better idea what was exactly talked about. But did you kind of wrap up with like how to make training more efficiently and how you can kind of get more out of less? Was that like some of the stuff you went over, or how did that go?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's absolutely like the as much as it's fun to talk about how much volume you need for hypertrophy, the first point I made is that it's incredibly difficult to quantify that. And so we're kind of left with a two-pronged question of how to be more efficient and how to make sure it's working. And those are two things I'd rather people focus on.
Yeah.
And I went through, and you'll see when you watch it, kind of seven ways to get more out of less, either less sets or less time. Because I think at the end of the day, time is really the main variable that we should be most protective of, the main currency that we're talking about here. And so those 7 ways, and I put them on sort of like a spectrum, where from more of a maximalist mentality to a minimalist mentality, as you move towards more of a minimalist, it's not that you do these things now and you wouldn't do them as someone who's training like a maximalist, someone who's really looking to push the boundaries. Everyone should be doing these in some regard. But the more you move on the left towards more of a minimalist, that knob, these are 7 knobs you can turn in differing amounts, right? Not all of them to the nth degree, but 7 knobs that you can turn to get a little bit more out of either less sets or less time. And I can happily run through them. The first one is getting closer to failure. I think that's an obvious one. If you're going to do less sets, if you're going to have less volume / less time, we need to get closer to failure on each. The second one is improving execution. Those two kind of go hand in hand. Being able to get closer to failure without technique breakdowns can get you more stimulus per set. Incorporating intensity techniques, things like myoreps, drop sets, supersets. Again, really, really, really great time-saving technique. This is not necessarily a volume-saving technique. It's a time-saving, a way to get more volume in less time, which again, ultimately the goal. Train more in the lengthened, less in the shortened. Again, doesn't need to be necessarily a specific percentage, but the more minimalist you become, the less room you'll have for short position exercises if your goal is hypertrophy. Again, doesn't need to be an extreme thing, and I don't recommend getting rid of the short position altogether, but on the spectrum in terms of volume distribution, you'd skew that more towards lengthened. And in the same breath, you'd skew more towards compound lifts, a little bit less towards isolation. Again, you'd probably still incorporate some knee flexion extension, some elbow flexion extension, maybe a lateral raise. But if you're training like a minimalist and you show me your day and it's like 3 bicep, 3 tricep, and a lateral raise, like you're not being incredibly efficient. That's just kind of an oxymoron there. And the last two are lowering your rep range, which is a little contestable. I think some people, not that I like that it was contestable, but I think it's underrated. I think if you are of the opinion you can get the same hypertrophy between 5 and 30, like what am I doing 25 for if I can get it done in 7, which is going to be a whole lot less time. I think there's another shout for lower within like, let's say 5 to 15. Let's compare like low being 5 to 15, high being 15 to 30. I think on average, those 5 to 15 are going to be both less psychologically demanding and potentially less peripheral fatigue, less systemic fatigue. Those are two different things, less systemic fatigue. Because of the lack of non-stimulative lead-in reps. However, I'm not changing my tune. I still think that as you become more of a minimalist, that's absolutely like the more minimalist you are, the less sets of 25 you're probably doing. Just because we got to get in, we got to get a stimulus, we got to get out. And it's going to save you some time. If you don't believe me, like make this switch and see how it goes. But I actually am moving a little bit into the realm of like definitely reminding people that there's probably no actual big downside to exploring the full depth of that range. And so while I would recommend skewing your volume more to the 5 to 15, I really have been opening my eyes to the fact that there's probably no downside to doing some higher rep work outside of it sucks and it's painful, and maybe some small upside. I think the guys at data-driven strength have been really great for just kind of reiterating that point of like, yeah, there's maybe some upside to doing lower rep stuff, but maybe there's some upside to doing higher rep, and there's probably no downside. And so I would skew, but not 100% in that direction. And the last one is choosing exercises that have higher stability setups. It's like if I'm only going to do, and this one is tricky too, because if it's like, hey, I'm only going to do one lengthened quad exercise, I might want to do a hack squat or a leg press where I can comfortably push a little bit closer to failure. That would be an example. Or if I'm doing like one tricep exercise, for me, I know this is an odd one, but I might do a unilateral. I know that maybe takes a smidge longer time. I don't think it actually does if you organize it well, but I might do single arm tricep extension because for me, I can push better closer to failure while I'm holding on with my other arm than if I'm doing like a bilateral cross cable extension. I get a lot of upper mid back fatigue, and I end up ending the set for that reason, which might be fine if I'm doing 3 to 5 sets with multiple tricep exercises. But if it's my only tricep movement, I need that thing close to failure, all the way to failure, myo rep, lengthen partials, and I got to do that like holding on with higher stability. So those were the 7 ways. And again, not things that, like those are all things, by the way, train close to failure, have good execution, use intensity techniques, train the length of position, train compound lifts, mostly lower reps, higher stability setups. Those are all things that basically everybody should do, but they are knobs that you would turn up a little bit the more time you're trying to save.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And again, I think that's, I feel like those are a lot of things we try to push people to do, like you said, anyways, right? And so that makes sense. But yeah, no, that's super cool. I think those are all like great tips, and I can see how they can be super helpful. And yeah, no, I think that's great. So was there anything else that before we hop off here that like that maybe we didn't go over that you think is important, or do you feel like we summed that up pretty well?
Yeah, I think we summed that up pretty well. Yeah, I definitely think that if you can understand that, like, if you can just decrease the amount of stress that you have around the volume recommendation you've been told and start to look a little bit more at your personal experience of whether or not this is working and are you enjoying it and how's your recovery going? I think like it's even more vague and ballpark than calories, but it's a very similar idea where it's like, hey, once you have a calorie amount, like you got to start doing it and see how it goes. And I think it's pretty similar in that regard, but even more wide ranging in terms of people's responses.
Yeah. And just adjust, and worst case scenario, you're probably not losing any muscle in the process. So, something to think about there. So cool, man. Appreciate your time. As always, a ton of great information. Before I let you go, anything coming up for you that you want to let the audience know about, or where they can find you?
Nope, not really. If you want to come chat, shoot me a DM, come hang out on Instagram, Jordan Lips Fitness. And otherwise that's it. Nothing really going on. Thanks for having me, dude.
Cool, man. We'll talk to you next time.
Thanks a lot, bro.